Hey, Michael. Happy January. Happy New Year. Can you give me a five? Yeah. Can you give me a fist bump? Can you give me a fist bump? Boom. Good job. Yeah. Hey, it's January. Happy New Year, everybody. Time to get back to work. Let's learn about Clemens von Metternich and the Congress of Vienna and a little bit about the Industrial Revolution, too. Sounds exciting. Yeah. All right. Let's learn something.
Stella sitzt in Rio, Stella liegt in Tokio. Männer fragen sie nach Feuer, nach dem anderen.
I couldn't think of a better song to introduce this particular recorded slideshow lecture. Today we have Clemens von Metternich and the Congress of Vienna. I also have a little bit of the Industrial Revolution sprinkled into this too. Let's begin. We're starting off the second semester with the early 19th century, which we begin with 1815 to remember. Napoleon has lost the Battle of Waterloo. He's been kicked out of Europe by the British. He's now in St. Helena, and Europe is a mess. It doesn't know what just hit him. You had one man, this Corsican, who took over France and then pretty much took over all of continental Europe, wrecked it up. All these great dynasties, the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, they're like, what the heck just hit us? They lost their kingdom and then they got it all back. And so now the big question is, well, what do we do? Like, how do we rebuild Europe? And that's where we begin in 1815, is how Europe is rebuilt. And Europe is rebuilt pretty much by one man. And here is that one man. He is the most important man, the most important individual of the early 19th century. From 1815 to 1848, here's the guy who's pretty much going to maintain the security of Europe. And his name is Clemens von Metternich. Born a German aristocrat, his family were refugees from the Napoleonic War. He ended up in Austria. And somehow ingratiated himself with the Habsburgs, and the Habsburgs will make him the Prime Minister of Austria. And he's Austrian Prime Minister from 1814 to 1848. He kind of he'll end up having to run away from Europe himself, sort of like Napoleon in exile at the very, very end of it. But Clemens von Metternich shows up on the scene, this incredibly talented, very important statesman, and he's got one goal: peace. He wants to restore peace in Europe. And as he sees it, the best way to restore peace is to restore all of these monarchies, which sort of makes sense because he's in the employ of the Habsburgs. So of course he's going to support the monarchies. But what a job. What a job. Is this one guy is going to try to create peace for all time, forevermore. So first thing, let's talk about his homeland. The Holy Roman Empire, in which he was born, now no longer exists. If you remember, 1806 is the final year of the Holy Roman Empire. We have no more Holy Roman Empire after Napoleon invades the German states and calls it the Confederation of the Rhine. And after Napoleon goes away, this confederation will remain. Metternich will call it the German Confederation. But it will once again be this loose confederation of the states, similar to the Holy Roman Empire. Metternich has a goal for the German states, his homeland, and that is to keep it a squishy middle of Europe, as sort of like a buffer zone in between these other major powers, France, Austria, and Prussia. So his goal, which seems kind of weird since he's German himself, but his goal is to keep the German states powerless and just keep it the squishy middle of Europe. That's his goal. All right. Napoleon. His other goal is, of course, to make sure that no Napoleon ever rises up ever again, ever. Metternich doesn't believe in Republican revolutions. He doesn't want to see this ever happen again. So, how do you achieve this goal? You got to remember that most of the people in Europe in some way admire Napoleon. Even if you're German and you hated this French guy invading you and taking over your lands, he did give you a taste of freedom. He brought with him the French Civil Code, what we call the Napoleonic Code, and you got this freedom. And so once you get this taste of freedom, how do you go back to living in a ancien regime-like system? So Metternich has a tough has a tough assignment. How do you make sure that nobody ever like this comes around again? So most famously, he holds the Congress of Vienna, which is one of the most important events in all European history. In fact, this is a definitive event. It's a defining event. It's why we start the second semester in this second half of European history with this event which finishes in 1815. The Congress of Vienna was an important diplomatic event, but it was also an incredible social event. Here's what Metternich does. Metternich, for the first time in European history, invites all of the European monarchs together in one place in one time. This, in and of itself, is a monumental event. It's never, ever happened before, that all the kings, all the monarchs from all around Europe, they all meet and they discuss what the future of Europe is going to be. So that, in and of itself, is incredible. So, again, Metternich wants to create peace between all of these men. So how does he do it? Well, the first part is a very, very human thing to do. He parties. He has these huge banquets. They engage in falconry and they go hunting. They do all the things that royals and nobles like to do. They essentially party, party, party until they are well sated and all very happy and exhausted. Then Metternich brings them down. As you can sort of see here in this image, he lays out the map of Europe and says, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to divide up Europe. We're going to see what belongs to everybody. So there's no contest over territories. We're all going to draw lines on the map, and we're all going to say this is mine and that's yours. And then we're going to decide how we make sure that there is going to never again be another Napoleon. So they sit down and then they draw lines, and that takes a little bit of time, and they also have to deal with things like, well, Poland and other small areas that they have to decide, who it belongs to. But then how do you deal with the Republican revolutions, making sure that no Napoleon ever happens again? And here's what they decide upon. If a revolution breaks out in any country, all of the other monarchs throughout Europe will send their armies into that one country to put down that rebellion. So let's say a rebellion happens in Berlin in Prussia. The Berliners rise up and they want to overthrow the Hohenzollerns and they want to have the Prussian Republic. What happens then? Well, of course, the Hohenzollerns are going to be trying to deal with this, but at the same time, the Russians will invade, the Austrians will invade, the French will invade, the British may invade, everybody comes in. So they will all put down, these huge armies will all put down whatever uprising is happening in Berlin. So this will stifle any Republican revolution. So it doesn't matter where the revolution may happen, Paris, Berlin, Moscow, Vienna, wherever, it doesn't matter. All of the European armies are going to descend and put down this one revolution. So that will work, and it will actually keep the peace in Europe until 1848. What happens in 1848? In 1848, there will be almost 50 revolutions that will break out simultaneously, and the armies all have to deal with their own country's uprisings, and they can't be all invading into one small little area like Berlin or Vienna or Madrid or wherever. So this is the peace system that Metternich sets up, and for the most part, it works. Let me just pause right here and mention how the College Board sometimes likes to deal with the Congress of Vienna. This is an example of a peace treaty that happens after a major catastrophic war. So after wars happen and they're all over, and everybody is in a time of mourning, and they really feel like, we never want to have this happen again. Then we look at the peace treaties that come out of that. The Congress of Vienna is seen as a conservative peace treaty because it brings back the status quo antebellum, the way things were before the war. And it's largely successful. It keeps the peace for quite some time. I mean, the distance between 1815 and 1848 is nothing to sneeze at. That's a substantial amount of time. The College Board sometimes likes to compare and contrast the Congress of Vienna with the Treaty of Versailles, which happens almost 100 years later, 1919, at the end of World War I. So, and that is considered to be a highly unsuccessful treaty because it leads right to World War II. So, the Congress of Vienna, a peace treaty that comes out of the Napoleonic War, very, very important in terms of how peace is maintained in Europe after the age of Napoleon. Okay, the 19th century is the era of isms, and all these isms come about that we have to learn about. And here are the two big political ones, conservatism and liberalism. Now, today in 2018, you probably have an idea of what it means to be a conservative and what it means to be a liberal today. What we consider to be a conservative and liberal today is very different from the way they thought in the early 19th century. In short, in all likelihood, no matter what you are today, a conservative or a liberal, if you were living in the early 19th century, you would have been a liberal. There are very few people who I think live in America today who consider to be conservative from the early 19th century definition, which is this. If you are a conservative in the early 19th century, you believe in maintaining monarchies. An old estate system like they had in France, the Ancien Regime, a monarch, nobility, and then everybody who serves under the nobility. So that is what it means to be a conservative back then. Of course, conservatism dominated the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815. Liberalism then was you were inspired by Napoleon. You wanted to get rid of monarchies. You wanted to have a meritocracy. You believed in a republic. You believed in some form of democracy. And you believed in a laissez-faire economic system, a free market, what we call today capitalism. These are the things that you believed in. So these are the two forces that are at work. And of course, this is what Metternich has to deal with. He wants to keep Europe a conservative continent, and he wants to make sure that liberalism has no voice. He wants to shut these guys down. So conservatism and liberalism, those are two very important things that you need to know about for this unit. Just so you guys know who these guys are that you're looking at in this slide. On the left, you've got Edmund Burke. He's actually Irish, but he's a member of the British Parliament. He's considered to be the father of conservatism. He's a very interesting guy. I will talk a little bit more about him within the context of my lecture on Mary Wollstonecraft later on this week when hopefully we're back in school. The guy on the right is Garibaldi. He was a celebrity king killer of the early 19th century. He was Italian. He traveled all around the Americas, South America, North America, spent time in New York City for a little while, and then he went to Europe to stir up trouble and to get people united, to fight kings and to create republics. He was known for his dashing red shirt that you see there. That's Garibaldi. There's actually a fish named after Garibaldi, the Garibaldi fish. It's all red. So there you go. Those are who those two guys are. All right, back to Metternich. Metternich, his goal is to maintain peace and to maintain boundaries for forever and ever and ever. If Metternich could jump ahead to the year 2018, he'd like to see a Europe that looks exactly like this, exactly like he set it up in 1815. And of course, he won't. The map of Europe, it'll actually stay pretty much like that for the most part until, well, Germany will become an empire in 1870, so that'll change things up a little bit. Italy will be all unified the exact same year. But really, things stay that way for another 100 years, and it's not until World War I that things really get shaken up and you have a whole bunch of new countries in Eastern Europe. All right, so here are two heavy hitters of the Congress of Vienna. These are the two guys I like to talk about, and they represent sort of two ends of the spectrum that are there. On the left, you have Viscount Castlereagh, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and then, of course, the guy on the right, you should know, Tsar Alexander I, Tsar of Russia, the grandson of Catherine the Great. Let me start with Tsar Alexander I. He is kind of the patriarch powerhouse behind conservatism. He is the one who really believes in the Metternich system, what we'll also call the Concert of Europe. He will make Russia what it will be called the gendarme of Europe. Gendarme is a fancy French word that means essentially the police force. Russia is going to be kind of the powerhouse. If you have a revolution in your country, it doesn't matter if you're all the way in Madrid, by golly, the Russians are going to come and kick your butt. So, and Tsar Alexander I strongly believes in this. Viscount Castlereagh is very different. British Prime Minister, he is the dissenting voice at the Congress of Vienna, thinks that all of these monarchs are just living in a dream, that you can't turn back the clock, that once people have got a taste of liberty, they're going to fight you for it, and you guys are, you kings are dreaming. The republics will eventually break out all throughout Europe. And so he's the dissenting voice. Castlereagh will make sure that Britain does not participate in the Metternich system. So if there is, for example, a revolution in Berlin or in Moscow or Madrid or Paris, the British army will not show up. He says Britain will not participate in this. Now, this sort of makes sense because Britain is a constitutional monarchy, so they've had their freedom since 1688. And they're not going to turn back the clock to English Civil War times. They've already gone through that. They kind of know that this is the movement of history. People want to gain more and more freedoms. And so Castlereagh will make sure Britain does not participate in the Metternich system as Metternich set it up. Check out this portrait of Castlereagh. I don't know what you think of it. I always like it. You've got this. Castlereagh was an interesting guy, and I don't know his full biography, but he had a line of depression in his family. Very, very sad. Viscount Castlereagh will end up committing suicide, supposedly because he was so distraught with the state of the world. But from what we know about depression and suicide today, mental illness can be genetically inherited, and he was not the only member of his family to commit suicide. He will have a very famous nephew named Fitzroy, who will be an admiral in the British Navy, and he commanded a ship called the HMS Beagle, who's the most famous. The most famous person to be on the Beagle was Charles Darwin. And Fitzroy and Darwin were friends, and Fitzroy will also commit suicide in his life. So Castlereagh, I just sort of like that portrait. It kind of has that brooding look of Castlereagh, very kind of thoughtful and introspective, and a guy who's just not willing to go along with, the partying kings of the Congress of Vienna. But this is what Tsar Alexander I called the Metternich system, the Holy Alliance. He looked at the three continental powerhouses in Europe. These would be Russia, Prussia, and Austria. France used to be one of these powerhouses, but they're not anymore. And he looked at these three countries as the ones that were going to protect this system. He called them holy because he believed in divine right. They got their power from God. So God has bestowed Russia, Prussia, and Austria with this incredible power. So Tsar Alexander I called this alliance the Metternich or the Holy Alliance. And just take a moment to think about what this means. And this next slide sort of addresses this. How has Europe kept peace before? Well, they've kept it with something called the balance of power. If one country gets to be too big, too strong, then other countries will unite and put it down. So, case in point, War of Spanish Succession. When the Bourbons begin controlling under Louis XIV, both France and Spain, then that's turning into a country that's a super country that's way too big and way too powerful. So here comes the Brits and the Swiss and the Austrians and the Prussians to put down the French and the Spanish and to disunite them. So that's how it worked before. And that's how it'll work again, but not right now. From 1815 to 1814, we do not have kings that are competing with each other, but rather that are cooperating with each other. Now, this creates a whole new situation where the kings are united together against their own people, which seems to be very anti-nationalist. The Habsburgs aren't going to care as much about the Austrian people as they are going to care about their alliance with the Prussians and the Russians and the French and all that. So I've got a couple of quotes here from Metternich, which are a good way to understand Metternich. And the first one's very, very simple. When France sneezes, all of Europe catches a cold, because the French are the revolutionaries. The French was the cauldron of the Enlightenment. It's where bad ideas come from if you're a conservative. These are the people that stir things up. It's always France. So when France sneezes, all of Europe catches a cold. So he really wants to make sure that no revolution ever happens in France ever again. This is a very 19th century statement. I think when we get to the 20th century, we'll say when Germany sneezes, all of Europe catches a cold. Germany is kind of the source of a lot of troubles in the 20th century. The next quote is a little bit more complex, and there's a lot to it, which actually brings us into the next part of the slideshow here, which is also the shorter part of the slideshow. But let's take a look at this two-paragraph quote here from Metternich. The first part says, "Presumption makes every man the guide of his own belief, the arbiter of laws according to which he is pleased to govern himself." Now, that's a bit of a mouthful. What he's talking about there is freedom. The idea that we are all free to govern our own lives, to govern our own lives, and to do as we will. As Americans today, I think we all like this idea that we do believe that we should, be the arbiter of laws according to which we are pleased to govern ourselves. But he didn't, and the next, because he doesn't believe that individuals should have freedoms. Everybody should serve the old aristocratic system. But the next part of the quote leads us into something else. Metternich says, "It is in the middle classes of society which this moral gangrene has affected." So here we have a new word for the 19th century, the middle class. The middle class. We've addressed this before when we called the middle class the bourgeoisie of the Third Estate and the Ancien regime of the French before the Revolution. But this is a new idea, the middle class. Who are these people? They are clearly not royalty, but they're not nobility either. So they're part of what the French would call the Third Estate. But who are they? They're educated. They're businessmen. They're merchants. They're traders. They are people with knowledge and money. And these are the people who, more than anybody else, want to break out of the Metternich system. These are the people that are going to believe in a laissez-faire economic system, a free market. They're what we call today capitalists. And they believe in a republic. They believe that they should be free. So I think most Americans today would say, well, we would not agree with Metternich's quote here because we believe in freedom. But Metternich saw the middle class people as a threat. Which brings us to the next part of the early 19th century lecture here. The Industrial Revolution. The middle class, we will have a rise in the middle class because of an Industrial Revolution. And the lower class, the proletariat, will also be profoundly affected by the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution. As a topic, I do not know of a single history teacher who enjoys teaching the Industrial Revolution because, quite simply, we don't know how to do it and make it interesting, fun, and exciting. But it's so important because it completely transforms the face of Europe and of the world, really. It certainly affected our country in terms of where people live, what the land looks like, how we make money, a lot of the social ills that come out of it, and as new ways of making money coming out of it. So the Industrial Revolution affects almost every aspect of our life. It affects every aspect of your life. I mean, the stuff that you wear, the things that you're into, and industrialism has created all this stuff. It's affected your life in ways that we can't even get into in this silly little lecture here. So, Industrial Revolution, it's not that exciting for a lot of us to teach, but I will do my best here. It's important to know the Industrial Revolution began in the middle of the 18th century in England. It began in England. The English started the Industrial Revolution. So, Why England? Well, there's three important reasons that I'll address for why it began in England. And the first is the fact that England has a constitutional monarchy. So people are a little bit more free in England. When you're a little bit more free, then you can, do innovative things. You can try new things, try new ways to make money. You can go out and try to make money. And, you obviously couldn't do that if you were a serf living in Russia when you're tied to the land. So having a constitutional monarchy helped England. Having a little bit more freedom helped England to have an industrial revolution, and it's why Americans will be good at the industrial revolution at the end of the 19th century. Also, why England? Second thing, trade. This is Napoleon had called England an island full of shopkeepers because there was so much trade happening in England. And trading gave rise to this merchant class as it did in the Netherlands and throughout the Hanseatic League. And so these traders are, they're good businessmen, and they're trading and they're bringing in resources from all over the world, which also helped England have an industrial revolution. And the third thing that I point to in my overly simplified reason for why England is the source of the industrial revolution is England has natural resources. Most importantly, England is an island sitting on a mountain of coal. The English will invent the steam engine will run off of coal. Trains are going to run off of coal. Like, the factories are going to run off of coal. And England has coal underneath its hills. There's also going to be a lot of coal in the Ruhr Valley in the German states, and there's also a lot of coal in northern France and in the area today we call Belgium. So that's where the coal is, and so go figure there's going to be a lot of industrialism happening in those areas, but it starts in England first. All right. It's important to know kind of the play-by-play of how an industrial revolution happens. The first thing is, when you start off with most people living and working on a farm, there has to be an agrarian revolution first. We have to invent machines and develop techniques that make farming a lot more efficient, so we don't need as many people on the farm. So this began in the middle of the 18th century with a guy by the name of Jethro Tull. And Jethro Tull invented a machine called a seed drill. And the seed drill is, as you can imagine, it drills into the earth and it plants seeds. So this cuts down on a lot of labor cost. If you've got a machine that you just roll it across the field, or you have a horse or whatever pull it across the field, and it digs up little holes and it drops the seeds in and it plants them, then you don't need all of these farm hands going around and doing it for you. So with Jethro Tull's seed drill, you don't need as many people working on the farm. So where are they going to go? Well, they're going to go to the city because James Watt, who is a Scottish man, has invented something called the steam engine. A steam engine had existed before. There was actually something called the Newcomen machine, which pumped water out of mines. As people dug mines down into the earth, they would fill up with water naturally. And this guy by the name of Newcomen developed a machine that would pump the water out. And James Watt developed that. So you had the external combustion machine, otherwise known as a steam engine. What this does is it generates power. We don't really have electricity harnessed yet, so these steam engines, they provided power to do whatever work you needed done in factories. So what's this mean? People are going to move from the country to the city. Cities are going to fill up. When you have this massive demographic shift from most people living in the countryside to living in the city, you have something called urbanization. And this happens, of course, in England first. Also, the English are going to be the first people to invent trains. They're going to use a steam engine, of course, to do this. And with trains, then we can move people and stuff all around the country very, very quickly, which is going to be very, very good for business. So England is changing. It all looks great, but not so much, because you put everybody together in the city. Diseases spread very, very quickly, especially the disease of cholera. And then you're going to have this, this class conflict, which hadn't really existed before in the past. Before, there were like peasants and nobility. But now you've got like people with money and people without money. And so you're going to have the middle class, you're going to have upper classes, you're going to have lower classes. And there's going to be poor people who are going to work these terrible jobs in factories because, of course, there's no laws to protect them. They can work long hours and in dangerous conditions. If they get hurt, there's no workers' compensation or any remote idea of workers' compensation. And a lot of these people can't even vote yet. They're excluded from the franchise because they don't own property. So it creates all these new social ills, which will be addressed by several people that I'll mention here at the end of this slide. There's moral decay. Once you've got a bunch of people living in the cities, you've got alcoholism, and then drug addiction. The drug of choice in the 19th century is called laudanum. Laudanum is opium, and the Brits get opium from India, where they make it from poppy seeds, and the English pretty much are able to fight or take over all of China with opium in a couple of opium wars that happened in the middle of the 19th century. They turned China into a bunch of drug addicts, which we may or may not have time to get to in the lectures of the late 19th century. Prostitution also rampant in industrial areas in England. So how do we deal with all this? Methodists become big in England in the early 19th century. They've, of course, existed since the early 18th century. But the Methodists are, of course, a branch of the Anglican Church. They're technically Episcopalians, but not really, because they believe taking the doctrine of Christ out of the church and into the streets, and they want to help people, and they want to provide them with this enthusiastic religious experience, which kind of speaks to the poor a little bit more than a boring Episcopalian service in an Anglican church. So the Methodists are there. And the Methodists aren't just there to help the poor, but also to provide the rich with a moral conscience. Like, look at all these people that are starving in the streets. Don't you want to help them? What would Jesus do? So the Methodists play a major role in the early 19th century, especially in England. The Utopian Socialists then. The Utopian Socialists come around in the early 19th century, and they try to create egalitarian factories where the factory workers aren't just workers, but they have the right to do things like vote in terms of how much they want to work, how the factory should be run, how much money they should be making, and all of this. So there's this idea that the Utopian Socialists believe that they could transform society by making the factories little republics. So the Utopian Socialists, it should be noted, will all fail. But they did come up with some pretty interesting ideas. They are in contrast to the socialists, the Marxists of the late 19th century, who thought the Utopian Socialists were all a bunch of idiotic dreamers. So when we focus on the Industrial Revolution, we history teachers want to look at all the negative effects. And a lot of entrepreneurial people who are critical of the educational system say, well, you don't focus on the great things that came out of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, they did create the modern world, like televisions, radios, the internet, computers, all this stuff comes out of industrialism. Don't these things make our lives better? And so let's finish off with our last slide here with something arguably pretty positive. Isambard Kingdom Brunel is this man's name. What a name it is. Isambard Kingdom Brunel. I sometimes have trouble remembering Isambard Kingdom, and I just call him Brunel. But, we Americans in the late 19th century celebrate our industrialist entrepreneurs, guys like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Jay Gould and Vanderbilt and all those guys who went from being bone poor to being super, super rich based upon their own cunning and their own brilliance and their own work ethic. And Brunel is kind of the original one of these guys. I identify him as the world's first industrial engineer. And his biography in a nutshell is, well, he started with his dad, who was an industrial engineer too, who was commissioned to build a tunnel under the River Thames in downtown London. So we don't have to just have boats going across the Thames, but we could actually tunnel underneath it. It was a very, very, very dangerous job, and it took a long time, I think 16 years to do, and quite a few people died because it flooded, people would drown down there, and it was a very scary thing. But Brunel, the young man, learned a lot about engineering and this idea that through engineering we could create a whole new world. And Brunel does. After helping his dad complete the Thames Tunnel, he got to work building bridges. Some of his bridges still stand today. And then he develops the first railway line in the world, the Great Western Railway. And the first railroad line went from London to the port city of Bristol. That way, shipping traffic that would come in would dock at Bristol. It could unload its wares, and it could be taken directly to London. But then he thought, well, why stop there? He lays railroad tracks down all over England, and then he says, well, why stop there? Let's connect England with the world, and he does. He wants to connect Bristol with New York City. So he develops the Great Western, which is the first transatlantic carrier, which will travel in between Bristol and New York City. He astounds the world in terms of his scientific brilliance. He creates an all-iron ship. People are like, oh, you can't build an all-iron ship, the thing will sink. But it's like, no, you need to know how ships work. And he builds the Great Britain, which is an all-iron ship. And then he creates the first huge, big luxury liner called the Great Eastern. Brunel, if there's any single individual who changed what England looked like, this is the man, Brunel. And kind of a cool picture that you see there. You see kind of an ordinary Englishman, but man, he looks larger than life with his hat and his cigar there. And look at those huge nautical chains behind him. All of this is his doing. So there's Brunel there, kind of our first great industrial engineer, industrial titan, as we would call him in the United States. So there we go. Guys, thanks for paying attention to all this. Hope you learned a few things, maybe took a few notes. So thanks for watching Eurobears. I'll see you guys in class. Have a great day.